My name is Hughstin, and I'm going to talk about invasive plant species here in Nova Scotia, and as well talk about some invasive plant pests, as I felt like they're very also important things to talk about. Yeah, so I work for the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council, and we're a provincial chapter of the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. So there is other working chapters of this organization, one in New Brunswick, PI, and so on. And we're the Nova Scotia chapter. We're a nonprofit environmental organization raising awareness and promoting a coordinated response to the threat of invasive species in Nova Scotia. So we do a variety of different things, including outreach activities like giving presentations. We also do surveying as well as environmental monitoring. We do some management, but it tends to be very project focused as we are a small group, and the management of invasive species is an extremely big task. And so the first thing I want to do is define what I'm talking about when I'm referring to invasive species. So an invasive species is any organism that is non-native to the area, typically has some way to spread rapidly in the environment and causes harm. So it has to have that negative aspect associated with it. So just because the species is not native does not automatically make it invasive, and either has to negatively impact ecosystems, human health, economies, and so on. And so there's many different types of invasive species, but today we'll primarily be talking about plants as well as a few invertebrates. And why do we care about them so much? A lot is the impacts that they do, in particular on ecosystems. It's well recognized that invasive species are a significant threat to native biodiversity worldwide. And they threaten many of our species at risk with extinction. And so they cause these issues through increased competition for resources. These species do not co-evolve in that habitat. They don't typically have those population checks. And you can see their populations expand rapidly. And many of them as well are also competitive in nature, and they can take over. They can also increase predation on particular species when introduced into new areas. They can also degrade habitat quality. Invasive plants can take over areas, one, reducing native plant biodiversity, which many species rely on, but also they can have other effects too, such as increasing rates of erosion and so on. And invasive species as well can introduce diseases. And so whenever talking about invasive species, it's always important to highlight a few species at risk that are threatened by invasive species, including the Blanding's turtle, which is threatened by Phragmites, black ash, which is threatened by the emerald ash borer, monarch butterfly, which is threatened by dog strangling vine, and the Plymouth gentian, which is one of the Atlantic coastal flora plants. And many of these are threatened by invasive plant species, and many more. So this is a very small list of species at risk that are impacted by invasive species. And so this is the other factor too, is the significant economic costs associated with invasives. These numbers here relate to all invasive species, not just invasive plants. And since 1970, it's estimated the total cost of invasive species is 2.168 trillion US. And this is a very conservative estimate, is likely to be much more than this. There's a lot of challenges and associated monetary values to the impacts of these invasive species. And then here in Canada alone, it's estimated to be at 35 billion. So how do they do this? One, being harmful to infrastructure. For example, Japanese knotweed, which is a very powerful plant. It's known to be able to push up through 8 centimeters of asphalt and can also damage foundations. They can also be harmful to human health. So the giant hogweed, very tall species that has its sap. If it gets on you, it can cause quite significant burns when exposed to UV light. This species has been identified in Nova Scotia, and there's a few areas that does have this species. They can also be harmful to recreational practices, whether it be impeding activities in that area, preventing access, or even just degrading the aesthetic value of the area. For example, this is multiflora rose, and as you can see here, is basically taking over the entire area. This is along a trail in Windsor, and the multiflora rose is everywhere in that area. And they can also impede agricultural and forestry practices, increasing the costs associated with them, whether it be invading into agricultural fields or impeding through making it difficult to move through forestry stands and so on. And so invasive species also are tied to climate change. And so there is a synergy between climate change and invasive species, where climate change make ecosystems more susceptible to invasive species, and invasive species can worsen the impacts of climate change. Climate change is also expected to expand invasive species ranges. So there's a lot of shifting of species, and some species that may not have been invasive before are becoming invasive in an area. We call these sleeper species, species that really haven't had much of an impact till now when the climate is becoming more favorable for them. And with increased extreme weather events, this creates disturbances, which increases the risks of future establishment of invasive species. So, how do invasives get here in the first place? Obviously, it's usually us. We're the ones, us humans, are the ones bringing them around and introducing them into new areas. In many cases, especially in regards to plants, invasive species are planted in a garden, not knowing of their invasive qualities, and then they then escape. And this is the primary source of invasive plant introductions into North America. Releasing unwanted pets can also release invasive species into the wild. The same with dumping aquarium plants, introducing new game species, whether it be for hunting or fishing. Commercial wood imports, as well as shipping, can all move invasive species around at a global scale. So then once they get to an area, how do they spread? Well, invasive species definitely spread naturally, and this tends to be at a more kind of local level. And it's something we can't really do too much about, whether it be through abiotic ways such as wind dispersal or floating downstream. There's also more biotic ways such as animal dispersal. For example, multiflora rose has rose hips that birds do eat, and the birds eat the rose hips, defecate the seeds elsewhere, and then you can get quite a large distance between the parent plant and the new plant growing. Then you also have natural movement as well. So this is just the ability of that invasive species to move around. Many invasive insects have wings and they can spread by themselves. But we as humans also spread invasive species, and this is typically how they move greater distances than they can by themselves or by natural means. And it is something that we can do about, which I'll kind of be talking about at the very end of these slides. So invasive species can hitch rides in boat trailers, ballast water tanks, seed stocks to hiking boot treads, tire treads to our pets, the movement of firewood, not cleaning off recreational equipment, or even contaminated soil can all spread invasive species around. All right, so next I'm going to talk about some examples of invasive species here in Nova Scotia. And so the first thing, kind of talk a little bit more of a general viewpoint, talking about invasive species. And so we have an iNaturalist project called Invasive Species in Nova Scotia. And with that project, all observations on iNaturalist in Nova Scotia gets lumped into this project. So far on that project, there is 146 species and 44,000 observations of invasive species in the province. And that includes all different types of taxa, but talking just about plants, as that is kind of the focus of tonight, 99 of them are invasive plants and 34,000 of them of the observations, almost, I should say 34.5 thousand of them are invasive plants. And yeah, and also of the top 10 reported ones on this platform, are 8 of them are invasive plants. So they are out and about, and they are quite abundant. And so this is a map here from that project again, showing where invasive plants are. And so you can see they're pretty much everywhere, but you can see a lot of kind of focus points where there's more human activity, as they are associated with the movement of us. And this also underrepresents the true numbers. This is all that's just been reported onto iNaturalist. And so there's many unknown observations out there. All right, so first we're going to talk about some invasive plant pests. And the first one I want to talk about is hemlock woolly dowgid. It's one of the bigger invasive pests in the province right now in terms of the impacts that it's having. It is a very small insect that infests hemlock trees. In this image here on the top left, you kind of can see them. This is, well, the mouse on this screen is kind of hard to see. But anyways, there's those little, oops, jumping ahead. Those little black spots there. And despite their tiny size, I'm jumping ahead of myself there. But yeah, so there's tiny little insects. They have a very long feeding or proboscis that they stick into the stem, and they feed on the nutrients and water storage cells at the base of these hemlock needles. Over time, this feeding causes needle loss and stem dieback. And when these insects get into large numbers, despite their small size, can kill hemlocks in 4 to 20 years. This invasive insect was first detected in the province in 2017, but it's believed to have been here for several years before its first detection due to the prevalence that it was found in that area. And so this species befriends all hemlocks in Nova Scotia. And this isn't just going to have an impact just on the hemlocks, as hemlocks are keystone species and shape the environment around them. This is going to have quite significant impacts on biodiversity. And so this is an image from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, showing the positive identifications of HWA in the province. And so primarily it is a lot of it, the densest areas are within Southwest Nova Scotia, and where there's already been seeing significant hemlock dieback in those areas, but it is spreading northerly. And these two sightings here they're the most recent ones that were in 2024. One at a park in the Bedford area, and the other one at the park just off of Grand Lake. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but yeah. So this species, in terms of identification, best way to identify it is looking for those white egg sacs that look like wool at the base of hemlock needles. You can also look for needle loss, fallen branches, as well as the tree crown turns a yellow/dull coloration. But other things can also impact hemlocks in that way. So the best way to truly know if it is HWA is looking for those woolly egg sacs. And so there's a few ways you can do that. Hemlocks are massive trees, so it's really hard to sample up into the crown. There is large pole pruners and even slingshots have been developed to survey for HWA. But you can also just look at fallen branches, flip them over, look at the underside for this species. And so it's really important if you are in a stand of hemlocks to lint roll after leaving the site to reduce spread. During most of the year, these guys don't move around. They are locked in. But at certain stages when they're in the crawler stage, they basically kind of fall from the tree, almost like pepper, and they're tiny, tiny little insects. And if they get in your clothing, you go to a new stand, you can easily move them around. And it only takes one individual to start a new population as they reproduce asexually. Okay, so the next invasive pest in the province is another big one is emerald ash borer. I do actually have a couple with me, so I'll hand around. So this is an invasive beetle that's a pest of ash trees. It's very host specific and only attacks ash trees and is a significant threat to the endangered black ash. Once infested, trees normally die after 2 to 3 years. And it has quite a high mortality rate of nearly 100%. This insect was first found in Bedford in 2018 and has spread outwards from that area. And this species primarily spreads the movement of infested wood. So here is an image showing the known locations of emerald ash borer. And so you can see the majority of them are in the HRM area, but unfortunately, there are now some new sightings outside of HRM in Hants County. This is of this year. So it's now outside of that regulated area, which is shown by that orange area. And there's also one down there in Annapolis Royal, but this isn't believed to be established. It was a dead specimen found in an Airbnb, but there was no other indication that it's in that area. So in terms of identification, one of the best ways, the symptoms of it is looking for ash crown dieback. So as shown in that image there, and you start to see as well as a lot of shoots coming out from the base of the plant, to compensate for the fact that due to the feeding of this beetle, it basically is cutting off the flow of nutrients to the leaves. And so it's compensating there. And you'll see a lot of these shoots coming up from the base. The larvae also form serpentine galleries, as shown in that image. There really isn't any other pest of ash trees that has a unique back and forth S shape. So if you see that, it's another good indication, and D-shaped exit holes. But those, even on heavily infested trees, are really hard to find. But again, if you do see that, that's another really good indication. Next one is spotted lanternfly. So I wanted to talk about this one as a species that's not yet in the province. It's not yet established in Canada, but there has been sightings of this species in the province. These were associated with dead ones found on cruise ships coming from the United States. So unfortunately, it's pretty more a matter of when it will arrive. It's pretty, and so this one, it feeds on a wide range of species, including grapes, apples, plums, cherries, pines, oaks, maples, and so on. It's over 100 different species it's known to feed on. For this one, though, the ecological and economical impacts are relatively unknown here for Nova Scotia. It is well established that it has quite a substantial impact on grapes, so it's going to have a decent impact on the vineyard industry. But in terms of the ecological impacts, it's unknown. There's some evidence it might attack and kill young maple trees. But to what extent that will have an impact on the population, not really sure. Because unlike those two previous species, these guys usually don't kill the plant outright, it just weakens it. And so in terms of spread, it spreads primarily through the movement of egg masses attached to garden, landscape items, cars, camper trailers, and so on. So here's some images of those egg masses. They kind of look like just dirt or could be strange looking lichen on a tree. So it's kind of hard to recognize them in the environment. But the adults, though, are quite distinctive. They have pale colored forewings, black spots, and very bright red, orange colored hindwings. Their nymph form as well is pretty unique looking with white spots. And then as it gets older in the later stage, it tends to get this more of a yellow red coloration. In terms of symptoms, it produces weeping sap wounds on the plants, and honeydew and debris can build up on the bark, resulting in fungal and mold growth. And then the last non-plant I want to talk about is jumping worms. So Jumping worms have been found in Nova Scotia, in particular in the HRM area. And so while most earthworms aren't native to Nova Scotia, and many of them as well have impacts on the Acadian forest, these guys, though, are particularly bad in the sense of how fast they rapidly change soil properties and how dense their populations can get. So they can impact water retention, nutrient cycling, and this alters soil structure, making it difficult for plants to grow in natural habitats. And this primarily spreads through contaminated soil. So in terms of identification, it will thrash around when disturbed. It's where it gets its name from. And some other features, the adults have a pale ring that encircles the entire body. With other species of earthworm, you typically don't see that full circles, the circulation there. All right, moving now on to some plants. So the first one I want to talk about is Himalayan blackberry. So this is a newly observed invasive species in Nova Scotia, or at least relatively newly. It was first observed only a couple of years ago, but unfortunately since then, after talking with the community and kind of figuring more things out, it's likely has been in the province for maybe potentially 3 decades. Right now, it's only known to be in Yarmouth and Digby County. Yeah, and this species was first introduced to North America as a cultivated crop. In particular, it is quite devastating on the West Coast, where it has escaped cultivation and is having quite huge impacts. And interestingly, with this population here, it's believed to have been taken from the West Coast a while back and then brought into someone's garden, where it then escaped. Yeah, so in terms of identifying Himalayan blackberry, it's a very large blackberry species. It can grow up to 3 meters tall and produce canes up to 12 meters long that will root at the tip. So it is very much bigger than the native blackberry species that we have here in the province. It also tends to be kind of semi-evergreen and holds onto its leaves much longer. We've seen it hold onto its leaves past December until there was an intense frost in the Yarmouth area, which then finally kind of started to drop them. Another distinctive feature of it is the underside of the leaves. So the compound leaves are a palmate structure, but they also have on the underside this dense fuzziness that gives it almost like a silverish coloration. And our native blackberries do not have that coloration with that particular compound shape. And they also have pinkish to white flowers. Some of them can be very pink, while others can be a little bit more on the whitish side. And sometimes they can actually be just pure white. So it's important to know that there is some variance there. But if you do see those pink flowers, it's a really good indication that it is Himalayan blackberry. So in terms of impacts, it creates these really dense, large, thorny thickets that outcompetes native plant species. Nothing can really compete with it. It climbs over and into trees and impedes the movements of large mammals. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to move through these thickets. And yeah, in terms of spread, I don't know where that line came from, but anyways, in terms of spread, it spreads by seeds and produces a lot of seeds per square meter. We're not sure exactly how many seeds are produced per square meter here in Nova Scotia. These are based off of the West Coast numbers, but it also can spread via stem and root fragments. And you can definitely see this in areas, in particular where it's been found along trails, where people will cut them back and throw them into the side of the trail system. And you can see it really spreading along by those means. With this species, we have been surveying for it, looking to see where it has been established and seeing if it is what type of spread. Because originally when we started looking at the species, we're only aware of a couple patches of it. And since we've surveyed it, we have identified 107 patches of Himalayan blackberry, the majority being Yarmouth County, in particular in the town of Yarmouth, but also we've found some as well in Digby County. But here's just a map showing of the Yarmouth area in particular. where it is quite abundant. You can see quite large patches of it along the Yarmouth waterfront, as well as the rails to trails moving northerly there. And here's just a few images of some of the stands or the patches that we observed of it. This one, you can see how large it is growing up and over top of a shed. There it is next to a house. And then in the bottom right and behind a parking lot where it's almost double the height of those cars that are parked next to it. And in that far left is along the rails to trails where you can see it kind of spreading throughout that area. So as a part this year, as a part of this project, we tried different kinds of treatments in terms of removing this very large blackberry plant just to see how much it would grow back after removing it. And we tried some different methods, including just cutting it back, digging out all the root crowns, as well as applying a herbicide directly to cut stumps. In that image there on the right, you can see just how dense these thickets are. This one had a rugosa rose as well that was using as kind of a gaining even more height. But it's basically, you just can't get through that. And then, so we visited the site a month and a half afterwards. We took just a few measurements just to kind of see what it was looking at. Like in terms of seedling density, it was quite high in just a 20 by 20 centimeter plot. We were seeing about like 99 seedlings on average, with a maximum being of around 144. So it has a very high amount of seedlings growing from that area. Though, to be fair, that soil probably hasn't seen the light of day in who knows how long. So it has quite a lot of seed buildup. But also as well, the length and how fast the canes grew back was pretty crazy. In a month and a half, we saw 181 centimeters of growth. And another thing too, this was done in August, so later in the growing season as well. But yeah, so it's an interesting plant for sure. And then next one I want to talk about is dog strangling vine. This is another one that we're quite concerned about in the province. There is two different species that are referred to as with dog strangling vine. So you got black swallowwort as well as pale swallowwort. Despite its name, it's not known to strangle dogs, but it does definitely strangle plants, that is for sure. So it was introduced to North America by horticulturists to be used in public and recreational gardens, where it then escaped. And so now it primarily spreads through natural processes such as wind dispersal as it produces abundant seeds. So for identification of this plant, the flowers are very much star-shaped. Both of these species are very similar in appearance. The main difference is the different coloration of flowers. So if black swallowwort, you get much more of a darker purple coloration, and then pale tends to be more of a pinkish color. These are twining vines, so they're basically just twine around any structure to gain vertical height, including themselves. And they have opposite leaves with a very smooth margin and tends to be kind of a dark greenish glossy leaf color. So in terms of why this one is quite concerning, one is the native plant biodiversity impacts. It's a really good competitor. It tangles basically anything and will grow over it. Well, it is a small plant, so not anything, but it is very competitive for lower growing plants. It outcompetes them for space, sunlight, water, and nutrients, creating these really dense vegetation mats. It's also toxic, so insects and other herbivores will avoid eating dog strangling vine populations. One of the bigger concerns is the potential impacts on the monarch butterfly. So dog strangling vine is in the same subfamily as milkweeds. And so there's been evidence of it being where monarchs will mistakenly lay their eggs on dog strangling vine, thinking it is their host plant. But unfortunately, these larvae that do feed on dog strangling vine have been linked with increased mortality. So it's been shown to have quite an impact on monarch butterflies. And so these numbers here, where it's laid up to 25%, these are in natural areas where it has both milkweed as well as dog strangling vine present. And these are kind of the higher end values that they were finding in that study. And so in terms of where it is in the province, there are two populations of dog strangling vine that we are aware of, one being Kenfell and the other one in Dartmouth. So we actually have both species present in Nova Scotia. So the black swallowwort can be found in Kenfell, and there's just a few images from the Kenfell site. And it also can be found, the pale swallowwort can be found in Dartmouth. With the Kenfell site, we've been doing quite a bit of work over the past few years, trying to contain the population. It has been quite a battle, but in areas where it has been a lot of effort has been done in controlling it, we have seen reduces in the abundance of this plant species. But every year it's always kind of coming back in a lot of areas that it's more challenging to get at and remove those roots. And then in the Dartmouth site, this one has been known to be there for quite some time. Unfortunately, though, when we surveyed for it a few years back, it has been found to expand quite beyond just the two plants that were first originally found in the area, and is now spread quite a bit along that area. And so we're hoping to now tackle that area depending on some projects. All right, so last plant I want to talk about is common reed. This is another big invasive plant species in the province. It is a perennial wetland grass that grows up to 5 meters tall. So it's a very big grass species. It was introduced to North America in the 1800s by seeds and soil ballast or by the horticultural trade. The earliest record in Canada was actually here in Nova Scotia in Annapolis Royal, which was back in 1910. And interestingly, in that area, it goes by a unique common name called elephant grass. I haven't heard of Phragmites being referred as this common name outside of Annapolis Royal area. And not entirely sure why, but there is a theory as to how it arrived there, which could be connected to it. It's believed to have arrived in Annapolis Royal on a circus train, where it was used as bedding. I don't know if that is the truth of how it arrived there, but it's been discussed in a few different articles that I read. But anyways, yeah, and so this species spreads primarily through underground rhizomes, above ground stolons, and seeds, as well as intentional plantings, unfortunately, as it is a unique looking grass species. It grows very large, and it can be found quite abundant in some areas, and it's an easy one to see on the side of the highway and take it. So the other thing though with Phragmites is there is a native subspecies, so not all Phragmites is bad. We have Phragmites australis subspecies americanus, and this species is not as the subspecies is not as aggressive as the invasive subspecies, but it can be challenging to differentiate between the two subspecies. And several characteristics should be examined, including stem color. So with the native subspecies, it tends to have more of a reddish coloration at the base, while the invasive is more tan to green coloration. Leaf color can be used, but I don't really use it that much as it's not very reliable. Ligule length is quite helpful. And so that is the structure there at the uppermost of the leaf sheath. And with the native subspecies, it is larger than the invasive subspecies. And the seed head can also be useful if it is present. With the invasive subspecies, it tends to be much larger than the native subspecies. This was a stand that we found in the Amherst area where it had what appeared to be the native subspecies growing next to the invasive, but likely there's another factor too, is they hybridize. So there's a good chance that the native one might not be the actual native subspecies, but a hybridization, because that native subspecies in the area is growing as if it is to the same level as invasive, or seeing it growing all along the sides of the highways there. But yeah, DNA testing would be needed to figure that one out. But yeah, so in terms of the impacts of this plant species, biodiversity is a big one. It outcompetes native plant species. It's a wetland species, so it gets in wetlands and takes over. It can also reduce habitat quality. In particular, this is where it impacts the Blanding's turtle by reducing basking sites as well as nesting sites. It also has impact on ecosystem function. It can reduce water levels over time. The rhizomes are so big, they will elevate the wetland surface level, reducing water levels, and can even flatten wetland topography. So when it gets in, it just kind of takes over, filling in ponds and streams. It can also have an impact on agricultural fields where when it invades into those areas and block highway sightlines. So this species is primarily moved around in highways. It likes to grow in ditches, and road maintenance moves it around. This video that has been playing in the background, thankfully, is not in Nova Scotia. This is from in Quebec, where along this highway, this video goes on for about 5 minutes of just constant phragmites, just all along, both in the median as well and along the sides of the highway there. So there hadn't been much research and stuff into phragmites in the province. And so over the past few years, we've been doing some surveying, road surveys in particular, as that's primarily how this invasive species moves around. And so we have surveyed approximately 4,000 kilometers within Nova Scotia, focusing on major highway routes and checking out any types of reports or naturalist observations as well. We have surveyed all the 100 series, and we still have a few chunks left that we plan on doing. And several other stands have been reported to us that we plan on checking out next year. But yeah, so in total, we have found 88 stands of invasive phragmites. And these stands range in size from only a couple stems to being very large stands of being over almost 9,000 meters squared. So in terms of the next steps with this project is one, kind of finishing off those highway systems, but also looking into some more species at risk habitat where phragmites is close to and identifying if it is present. And here's just a few photos of some of the patches of invasive phragmites, just to kind of give you an idea of how big this plant is. So the patch here in the bottom left is an Annapolis Royal, where it can be seen kind of spreading throughout that area quite a bit. It's been there for over 100 years. It's just this image was taken just behind the botanical gardens there. There in the middle, up at the top, is a smaller stand that was likely recently established. The stand on the right there is just on the side of the highway. If you're coming from the airport heading towards Halifax, right before that separation, there's quite a large dense stand there. And then on the bottom right, that's a stand in the Pictou Harbor area where there has been quite a bit of spread in that area. It is, forgot to mention, it is also salt tolerant, so it doesn't mind salt, and you'll see it growing in saltier areas as well. In the image in the middle there is me just standing in some phragmites where I was collecting some for a workshop, just to show you how big this plant is. And so, yeah, so those are just a few highlighted species I want to talk about. It could be here for quite a few nights if I want to talk about all the different invasive plants in the province. But here's just a quick summary of a few invasive plants that are problematic in the area, or not super problematic, but anyways, just highlighting a few of them. So how do we prevent the spread of invasive species? Well, eradication is very expensive, takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. And so here is the invasion curve, which I always kind of talk about. Basically, it shows that over time, area infested goes up. As the infested goes up, so do the control costs. And so right now, with dog strangling vine, we're sitting very lower on that scale where eradication is feasible. It's only known to be in 2 populations. But if we're talking about something like Japanese knotweed or multiflora rose, we're now sitting up at the very top there where local control and management are pretty much the only option, as it is very widespread. So it's really important to prevent further spread of invasive species. It's the most cost-effective way to preventing and tackling this issue. And so we have several different programs that try to create different ways that we all go about recreational behaviors to prevent the spread of invasive species. The first one targets boating practices such as clean, drain, dry. So just about the importance of cleaning your boats, removing plants, animals, and mud from boats and gear, drain all water from boats and gear onto land, and dry all parts of the boat and gear completely before launching it into a different body of water, as many invasive plants and other organisms can move around on boats that have not been cleaned. I know tonight we've been mainly talking about plants and invasive plants and other pests, but zebra mussels is another important one. Just to briefly mention, has been found in New Brunswick. It's not in Nova Scotia, but it is really important to clean, drain, dry to prevent further spread of that particular species. Don't let it loose. So this one is about pets and not letting pets and plants into the wild, as when they can become potentially invasive. Some common release pets include goldfish, turtles, bunnies. And so it's really important to find them a new home instead of releasing them into the wild. And if you do have an aquarium as well, to not release them into water bodies. If you got plants in there, instead dry the land first and then properly dispose of it. In this image here is a Carolina fanwort in Frog Pond, which is taken over a lot of the Frog Pond area. And unknown to how it arrived there, but it could have been a potential aquarium release. Or it could have came in through boating practice. Play, Clean, Go. This program is all about cleaning your gear before and after entering recreational site. Just removing plants, insects, and mud from your boots, gear, and pets, and checking tires of bikes and ATVs to remove any plant parts before moving to a new area, as many invasive plants have food structures that are adapted to clinging on fur and cling very well onto clothing as well. Buy local, burn local. So this is all about buying firewood at or near where you're going to use it, and leave any unused firewood on site, as invasive pests, in particular forestry ones, can hitch a ride on contaminated wood and spread them quite far distances. And then there's the PlantWise program. So the PlantWise program is all about creating awareness of invasive plant species and gardening practices, creating awareness of why they're a problem, and what we can all do to prevent their spread. It also includes promoting the sale and purchase of non-invasive alternative plants, providing details on how to control or replace invasive plant species, and how to dispose of unwanted plant and plant material properly. And so a big component of this is the Grow Meanstead Guidebook, which lists off many invasive plant species used in horticultural practices or were used in the past. And many of these species too, some of them may not be super problematic yet in Nova Scotia, but they have been identified as problematic in other areas of North America on the East Coast. And with the shifting of climates, they're very likely to become problematic in the future. And so this guidebook can be found online on our website, on the Grow Meanstead page in both French and English for free too. But yeah, and so the last thing I kind of wanted to mention is just reporting invasive species. And if you do see invasive species when you're out and about, report it onto iNaturalist, or you can also report it directly on our website as well, where we'll get an email and we can respond to you onto the next steps. And so this adds important data to let us see where invasive species are in the province. We are a very small nonprofit organization, and so it's nearly impossible to know where all the invasive species are without help by iNaturalist users. But yeah, some key takeaways: invasive species can be devastating to biodiversity, harmful to people, and expensive to control. Invasive species are extremely difficult to remove once established. The prevention and reduction of spread is the best management option. and humans play an important role in the spread of invasive species. Therefore, we play an important role in stopping them. So I'm going to say thank you to our funders that allow for all the different projects that we're working on each year to happen. And wanted to highlight an upcoming event as well. We are hosting our Nova Scotia Invasive Species Forum this Thursday. In-person tickets aren't available anymore, but it is available online. The virtual tickets are and can be found on our Facebook. So thank you for listening to me talk about invasive species. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Peter Steiner asking if you had any updates in the state of the the biocontrol program out of the Acadia Bug Lab.
I don't really want to speak too much on it because it's not really something that the Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council is too much like active with, and we're more or less would be from like it is happening, but like to know the current status, I don't really want to. Yeah. So the biocontrol, they're looking at bringing over. So with Hemlock woolly adelgid, there is a population on the west coast that is considered to be native to the area, and they have specialized insects that feed on HWA that are very specific to HWA. And so they're looking at bringing them over to Nova Scotia and introducing them into Nova Scotia, because the only real way to control this species is to have it basically come into an equilibrium, because there is all these pesticides that can be applied, but they're short term. They only last for, I think, 6 years, and then they have to be reapplied. So it's something that, and it will take a while. It's going to take quite like several years before it becomes into effectiveness. But yeah, they're looking at 2 different species, the copious beetle as well as silver flies, because with HWA has 2 generations each year. And so that in order for the it's a really weird insect, but in order for the biocontrol to be effective, they need to target 2 different life stages of it. So the beetle targets 1 generation, and then the silverfly will tackle the other generation of the year, because if they don't have both, the population just bounces right back. Because they are reproduce asexually, and it's pretty impressive how fast it will bounce back. But yeah.
Is burning bush considered invasive?
So burning bush does have some invasive qualities for sure, and there is evidence of it spreading. Yeah, it would be considered invasive, and in areas and like in eastern United States, we're a bit more south, it is quite problematic, and we are starting to see evidence of it being able to spread here as well. But yeah, Scotch broom is another one that is in the province, and it's quite abundant in Shelburne area. We can see it all along the highways there. And depending on what time of the year, it's very yellow or it's very green, because it does have those green stems that holds on. But yeah, it's something that definitely has a potential impact in the area. I don't know what extent it is having an impact ecologically, but it is definitely spreading. And in Shelburne area, you can see it all along that highway.
Once you say it increases forest fire intensity, did it actually affect the forest fire in Shelburne?
I'm not sure. So like a lot of these, like this stuff would have came from the West Coast, where it is a bit more, where it's been seen as being more problematic. Where it is located in Shelburne, it's not, I don't think it would have had too much of an impact, because
I think it's a little further up the road.
yeah, like I'm just trying to think where, but yeah, I don't think it would have had probably in that situation now. But yeah.
There's someone quite by the
Is there? Oh, lovely. Yeah, it's not a good one.
Another question here is ranunculus scleratus, whether or not it's a native plant or a invasive. That's the Persian buttercup. Are you familiar with that one at all?
Not that particular, no. If whoever, I'm not sure who asked
Sometimes
it,
like
but
iNaturalist
oops.
will label something as, native or
Mm-hmm.
not, and that's where it is. I think those people that have a different opinion on that.
Yeah, yeah, it can be, it can definitely be like what is the definition of invasive? Like what makes one particular plant invasive in terms of those impacts? So
Yeah.
it can be a challenge there. And yeah, if you want, feel free to send me an email, and I can get back to you on that particular species too.
Biate here. I have a question.
All right.
I was wondering what government initiatives are in place to try to prevent the invasive plants from being sold in the industry in the first place?
So I'm honest, I'm not aware of any currently in terms of in Nova Scotia of preventing the sale of invasive plant species in gardens. I mean, in garden centers. From a government standpoint. Yeah,
Purple leaf spread is still pretty common in garden centers.
yeah, yeah, and so like that's where that's where the Plant Wise program, like we're trying to create educational kind of pieces from the bottom up approach. But yeah, unfortunately, we're not aware of any at least.
The question here, I gotta go back to the mic.
Okay.
I'm just reading some of the questions from the chats here. It's from Julie. I had a question about the use of invasive species and proper collection. So she creates pigments for printmaking. And is there any advice for the collection to make sure there's no spread? And for disposal, once a plant has been simmered or boiled, is there any guidance on disposal of what's left? Would there be any risk after simmering for 30 to 60 minutes? I think that's probably pretty safe, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if it is just like plant matter, it's going to be pretty safe. But in terms of like collection and those kinds of things, the just cleaning off your gear when you leave the site, making sure you're not moving any kind of mud around, those kinds of things. And if you are collecting the plants, make sure you collect them in a very well tight container, and there isn't a chance for them to, get lost mid-transportation.
Okay. Jeff White's asking if there's any invasive plants that are not yet in Nova Scotia, but the ones we should watch out for.
Yeah.
We've indicated a few there, but yeah, really.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
And I think the dog strangling vine is a big one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's here, but it's only in pockets, right? But when it starts going, it goes real fast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that one's a really important one to keep an eye out for. And if you do see it, report sightings to us or onto iNaturalist, either way. I'm not sure exactly which one to say in particular for Nova Scotia, which one would be extra problematic to talk about. There's quite a few, like kudzu is one big one.
Will it live this far north?
I don't know. That's
I mean,
the thing.
I
It's
saw
like,
it in Japan.
Yeah.
It was pretty far north. Yeah.
Like I know there's been sites in Ontario where it's been found,
Oh yeah.
And so I'm sure it would.
Oh,
Yeah.
Another question about Japanese beetle.
Okay.
How do you deal with them?
Yeah, so actually, no, I got rid of that slide, but yeah, no, Japanese beetle. It is a challenge to remove. There is the pheromone traps that can be used to try and kill them and collect them. But the issue with those is if they're not done at a large scale and you're the only one using those pheromone traps, it can actually attract more to your property than because not all of them will go into that trap.
Yeah.
And so if you're the only one using those traps in the area, they're not very effective. At a large scale, there's somewhat effective.
Yeah.
You can also use nematodes for your lawn, because when they're in their grub stage, they're feeding on the lawn roots.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And so you
Okay.
can
Yeah.
use nematodes, but again, if no one else is controlling for it in the area, they will likely just kind of each year, unfortunately, come back. And other than physically picking them off, there honestly isn't an easy answer there for that one.
Yeah, I've really noticed the increase in the populations of them lately.
Yeah, there's some work looking into biocontrols for this one. Not in the province, but I think it's in PEI. But I don't know too much other than that. There's currently being looked into.
David McCormick was asking if they preferentially feed on non-native plants. I don't think they're that picky.
Yeah, they eat a lot of different things, but you definitely see them more kind of lately, at least in the urban areas, attacking ornamental
Yeah,
species. But they
that's true,
do
yeah.
have they have a very wide range of species. There are over
Yeah.
250 host plants that will like to enjoy eating: blueberries, roses, blackberries. So yeah.
They eat that Japanese knotweed, I wonder.
We've seen them eating, but not to a high level.
Yeah, was Jeff saying if we could only get it out of the multiflora rose? Why? I mean, I've seen it on the rugosa rose.
Yeah.
I haven't seen. Oh, if it's on the multiflora. Doug Van Hemison, by the way, is saying that the ranunculus scleratus is listed as S2 versus SNA exotic. So I guess this is that cursed buttercup. I always thought of it as a native species. It's not a very attractive plant, and it actually is somewhat toxic. Like it can give you blisters. You know,
Okay,
that's why it's called cursed buttercup. I think it's native. That's all I've got here. Any other questions from the group? It's been really good, and it's like I feel like we just got the tip of the iceberg here, you know. So much.
Yeah.
Yeah. But thank you very much, Hughstin, and I really appreciate the time and effort you put into this presentation and what your group is doing in general. I mean, I think it's really excellent that the province has people looking out for it. Somewhat, you know, I wouldn't say you're content, staying on top of it exactly, but you're at least making people aware and making it that. What sort of things do you do, like in terms of groups going out and pulling out plants and things like that? Do you have that sort of posted on you have sort of gatherings like that, or what happens?
So we don't yet. We do, sorry. Yeah, we do have our yearly dog strangling vine pull in Penfield, where it is a community event. But it's something that we are hoping to kind of expand. We are small at this point, but it is something we would like to eventually kind of get to, like you said, trying to create more of a volunteer-based kind of group to help with removals if someone has those type of issues. But yeah, we don't have quite know how to navigate that quite yet. Yeah.
I mean, did you arrive at any conclusion that the Himalayan blackberry is a way of eradicating it, or is it?
It's so the whole premise of the earlier stages of this project was based off the fact that there was about 10 sightings of it in the province originally, and then when we surveyed it, finding way more of it. And so at this point, those treatment methods, if it's done every single year, will have an impact in controlling it, but it's a lot of effort to remove it. And being that many different patches, the actual eradication is quite unlikely at this point, unless because it's on private land. It's like a variety of different people using it. And the other issue too is it produces blackberries, and people do like it too. So there is that component as well.
Right?
Yeah, when we were, for example, removing it, we had a few people ask why you were removing our blackberry plants.
Yeah.
So yeah. But yeah.
Okay, well, I think that covers it. So sorry, I'm gonna wrap up here. So our next meeting will be in March, fourth Monday. I don't have the actual date in front of me, but and it'll be Zoom only. And Jeremy here will be taking us through the Barrens of Nova Scotia, which I'm really looking forward to because I find that some of the most fascinating stuff in the province. So, and then the month after that, in April, is our annual general meeting, where we traditionally have the ACCDC give a talk on what their activities have been for the year. So that's always interesting as well. So that pretty much covers it. Just stay in touch on the website occasionally. We'll post things if they come up. Any field trips. Sometimes Charlie in particular is pretty good at just getting the urge and getting out at short notice for a field trip. So keep your eye on that. And we'll post things as we organize things. We'll post